Is there anything Trump can do, Michael Knowles, that you would say, I condemn it, and you hop off the Trump train, or are you going to tickle his taint for the rest of your fucking life?
No, there have been plenty of Trump policies that I've criticized because he's only right about 99.78% of the time.
Oh boy. Michael Knowles thought that he was being clever, but he's just accidentally admitted that his political independence is a rounding error.
99.78% of the time.
When you agree with your movement's leader 99.78% of the time, you aren't a thinker. You are a cultist.
Such a cuck.
But I would say the rest, excuse me, I would say the rest of the...
Such a cuck.
Why hello, my fellow apes, I hope you are well. That was Kyle Kulinski, left-wing commentator and host of Secular Talk, facing off against Michael Knowles, Daily Wire darling and one of the slimiest propagandists in the MAGA media ecosystem. The venue is Piers Morgan's Uncensored, where Piers brings together voices from across the political spectrum, usually to generate heat rather than light. Now, this debate took place shortly after the US invaded Venezuela and captured its president Nicolas Maduro, an act that would have been unthinkable under the old international order. Michael, predictably, has been defending Trump's right to do it.
Somehow he's managed to pacify both the neocons and the non-interventionists. It's a stroke of brilliance, I think. Say the rest of the...
Such a cuck.
And while his moment of accidental honesty about his loyalty is hilarious, the rhetorical path he took to get there is even more instructive.
A lot of our liberal friends think history began a few decades ago.
You see, throughout this exchange, Michael relies on a specific logical fallacy called equivocation, dishonestly ignoring modern context and usage to encourage a return to empire building of the past.
International law goes back to antiquity. It's not some creation of modernity.
But Kyle doesn't let him get away with it. And, more importantly, he shows us how to defeat fascists on their own stage.
You're not an independent thinker, and you're meat-riding Trump.
Why do you say
that? Know that what he's doing in imperialism, and you don't care.
Not with logic, but with the kind of ridicule their populist audiences respond to the most. Alright, grab yourself a coffee. I don't know where I've... yes, perfect. Thank you very much. Grab yourself a coffee. They haven't actually paid for a brand sponsorship, but it is what it is. We pick up as Kyle asks a simple question about China.
But again, I come back to the fundamental point, which is, if you sign on to stuff like this, you're saying might makes right and the law of the jungle is back. What you're saying is China has a right to go into whatever smaller country they want and depose the leader and say we're doing it because we can and we have the right to do it and we have bigger guns and there's nothing you can do to stop it. So they're never going to address that fundamental question, which is, why do we have a right? Do we actually believe in international law, or was that all a joke? Are we rolling the clock back to the 1700s and the 1800s, and we're going super primitive style here?
Quite the opening salvo. Kyle opens with a test of Michael's consistency. He's not defending Venezuela or attacking America directly, he's using China as the test case.
What you're saying is China has a right to go into whatever smaller country they want and depose the leader and say we're doing it because we can and we have the right to do it and we have bigger guns and there's nothing you can do to stop it.
If Michael believes that America has the right to intervene based on power, he must also grant that China has that right. If he denies China that right, he exposes himself as a hypocrite. If he grants it, he admits to supporting global anarchy. The frame is established. Might makes right versus rule of law.
Are we rolling the clock back to the 1700s and the 1800s, and we're going super primitive style here? And I think the answer to that is yes, they want to go super primitive style.
International law goes back to antiquity. It's not some creation of modernity, whether we're talking about the 1700s or the 20th century.
I described Michael as slimy, and here we have an immediate example. He ignores the China hypothetical completely. He can't answer it safely, so he pivots to a definitional debate. By invoking antiquity, he's attempting to wrap Trump's behaviour in the prestige of Rome. He's trying to redefine international law from written treaties that we've signed to vague historical customs. It is a retreat to abstraction. When you can't defend the specific, flee to the general. Speaking of framing, a story that perfectly illustrates this caught my attention recently. Maxwell appeals for clemency from Trump as she declines to answer questions from lawmakers. The facts are simple, right? Maxwell appeared before Congress, refused to answer questions, and offered to testify about Trump's innocence in exchange for mercy.
I therefore invoke my right to silence under the Fifth Amendment to the US Constitution.
But what different outlets do with those same facts is remarkable. If you want to follow along, head to ground.news/rationality, because the breakdown on this one is Fascinating. Ground News shows me that this story has been covered by 370 different sources, 71 leaning left, 61 leaning right, and 131 from the centre. If you're unfamiliar, Ground News is a website and app designed to make reading the news easier and more data-driven. Every day, they gather thousands of news articles from across the world and organise them by story, each presented with visual breakdowns of the reporting bias, reliability, and ownership, all to help you understand why you're seeing what you're seeing. Look at how this single word choice changes the entire story. Bossip, a left-leaning outlet with mixed factuality, leads with quid pro quo. So before you've processed the details, they've told you this is a corrupt deal. WLT Report, far right with low factuality, headlines it as Ghislaine Maxwell clears President Trump's name, with clears in all caps. She's not bargaining, she's vindicating the president. Same deposition, opposite narrative. Then there's the centre, represented by the New Hampshire Union leader and the press of Atlantic City, rated with high and very high factuality respectively, who simply report Maxwell declines to answer questions. No judgment, just what happened. And notice, the factuality rating lines up almost perfectly with the amount of spin. The most neutral language comes with the highest rated sources. That's exactly the kind of pattern that Ground News makes visible at a glance. If you like what you see, know that you can get 40% off their Vantage plan at ground.news/rationality or scan the QR code on screen. Signing up not only supports transparent media, but also this channel. Thanks.
Whether we're talking about the 1700s or the 20th century.
The Geneva Conventions, the Nuremberg Tribunal, the Geneva Conventions and the Nuremberg Tribunal.
Kyle immediately blocks the retreat to Rome. He cites the specific modern treaties that actually govern the world today. He's forcing Michael to look at the actual laws, Geneva, Nuremberg. These aren't abstract principles from antiquity. These are the specific frameworks that emerged from the pile of 60 million dead.
The Geneva Conventions and the Nuremberg Tribunal?
Yes, those exist, but international laws, the jus gentium goes back to antiquity.
And here we have that equivocation, using the same word with different meanings in the same argument. Carl was talking about international law as the modern framework, Geneva, Nuremberg, the UN.
The Geneva Conventions and the Nuremberg Tribunal?
With enforcement mechanisms and explicit prohibitions on wars of conquest. Michael substitutes for a different meaning, the jus gentium, an ancient Roman concept with no enforcement mechanism and no prohibitions on taking territory by force.
Yes, those exist, but international laws, the jus gentium goes back to antiquity.
This is the core sleight of hand. He's hoping the Latin phrase sounds impressive enough that you won't notice that he's talking past Kyle and not engaging in good faith. And it would be remiss of me not to say, there's a reason that this rhetoric sounds so familiar. The last political movement to romanticize Roman authority, reject international constraints, and embrace might makes right as a governing philosophy, called itself, and say it with me now, Fascism. The name itself, in fact, it's taken from the Roman fasces, a symbol of authority. The post-World War II order wasn't just built to prevent wars, it was built to bury this exact worldview. Michael is digging it back up and attempting to give it an air of sophistication.
International laws, the jus gentium goes back to antiquity. However, unfortunately, a lot of our liberal friends think history began a few decades ago.
Caught in the equivocation, Michael attacks those liberal friends who think history began a few decades ago. This is a status move. I know Latin phrases, don't you know? You can only recall recent history. It's an attempt to regain authority without addressing the argument. He's mocking liberals for being stuck on the Nazis or actively rehabilitating fascist ideology. And notice what he's projecting. He's the one ignoring why the modern framework was created. He's the one pretending that history stopped at Nuremberg.
However, unfortunately, a lot of our liberal friends think history began a few decades ago.
The League of Nations was useless. It fell apart, and that's why we had the UN. That's why we had the Geneva Convention.
Right, I'm talking about millennia ago.
Carl ignores the insult and focuses on the timeline. He points out that the useless old systems failed, which is precisely why the modern laws exist.
The League of Nations was useless. It fell apart, and that's why we had the UN.
He's emphasizing Michael's beloved antiquity, not as a noble foundation, but as a failed state.
Now, I'm talking about millennia ago.
And here, Michael makes it explicitly plain. He's talking about millennia ago. Not the post-World War II order, not even the League of Nations. He wants to roll back to a world where powerful nations took what they wanted and called it civilization. That is not a slip. It's his actual position. He doesn't care about international law, safety, or even the lives of others. He cares about whether the USA can force a new empire on the world. And you've got to say, how lovingly Christian.
Right, I'm talking about millennia ago,
because we looked
not
at
merely
piles of millions
but it's true.
of
Woodrow
dead
Wilson
bodies,
failed
and
with
we
the
said
League of
that's a
Nations.
bad idea. We looked at piles of millions of dead bodies and said that's a bad idea. Let's not do that anymore. Let's actually have a framework and rules and laws. And Trump is blowing that up. By the way, he bombed fishing boats from Venezuela, Trinidad, and Tobago, and Colombia. He just did the regime change in Venezuela. He bombed Yemen and Somalia and Nigeria and Iran.
Realizing the pointlessness of the definitional debate, Kyle turns to the forensic. Why do we even have these laws? Because we saw countless dead in the name of living space and decided to do something different. And then, without pausing, Kyle starts stacking specific accusations. Fishing boats from Venezuela, Trinidad and Tobago, Colombia, Yemen, Somalia. He's not letting Michael run an abstract history. He's forcing him to defend specific acts of violence against specific countries happening today. He's making it concrete and tangible, which frequent viewers of this channel know is a very good move.
He just did the regime change in Venezuela. He bombed Yemen and Somalia and Nigeria and Iran. He's threatening Greenland.
Michael concedes the violence, but tries to rebrand the victims. Fishing boats become drug boats. People become narco-terrorists.
Somalia and Nigeria and Iran. He's threatening Greenland.
He's repeating the administration's narrative as fact, despite zero evidence that these boats were carrying drugs. The same administration that refused all calls for transparency. They used aircraft disguised as civilian planes and shot survivors clinging to wreckage in the water. These aren't disputed drug interdictions. They're war crimes with a cover-up. And Michael is using the stigma of drugs to justify the acts of war. Notice that he's not denying the action, he's defending it. The frame shift is the whole strategy. If the targets become terrorists, then the bombs were justice.
In Somalia and Nigeria and Iran. He's threatening Greenland and Panama and Canada and Cuba and Mexico. And you sit there the whole time and act like it's okay. Is there anything Trump can do, Michael Knowles, that you would say, I condemn it, and you hop off the Trump train, or are you going to tickle his taint for the rest of your fucking life?
And now, with the receipts on the table, Kyle asks the ultimate question. Is there a line? This is a double bind. If Michael says, no, there's nothing Trump could do, he admits to being a cultist. If he says, yes, there is a line, he has to name a crime that Trump hasn't already committed or threatened, alienating his own supporters. Keep in mind, Michael has been sitting there smugly responding, it's okay, and it's good to every act of American aggression Kyle names. He's been smirking through the list of bombed and threatened countries like Kyle's reading a grocery list. Bored dismissiveness, treating atrocities as mundane. Now, at this point, Kyle has won the facts, but he knows that that is not enough. Michael's audience isn't watching for facts, so Kyle goes in for the kill with the kind of rhetorical dominance the populist right worships. It turns out the sunglasses indoors aren't just a look, they're a statement.
Why are you wearing glasses?
Sunglasses.
Yeah, we're inside.
We are inside. Very perspicacious of you.
The vulgarity, tickle his taint, is strategic. It's designed to puncture Michael's intellectual gentleman persona and drag him into the rhetorical mud. Kyle is fighting the right on the right's terrain, using their own tactics against them.
Or are you going to tickle his taint for the rest of your fucking life?
The phrase frames Michael's sycophancy in terms the MAGA base recognize as emasculating. The target isn't just Michael, it's his audience, the high-energy, populist, don't-give-a-fuck crowd, the sort that loves Trump's abuse of power.
Or are you going to tickle his taint for the rest of your fucking life?
No, there have been plenty of Trump policies that I've criticized because he's only right about 99.78% of the time. So the First Step Act, I thought, was a misstep.
Oh boy, there it is. I know that he's being a bit facetious, trying to troll, but this is still Michael's proof of independence, and the number he chooses destroys him. First, the math. 99.78% is essentially indistinguishable from 100%, which is exactly the point.
He's only right about 99.78% of the time.
Pretend disagreement while aligning with his glorious leader. Second, look at the example that he reaches for. His one criticism? The First Step Act, criminal justice reform that reduced sentences.
So the First Step Act, I thought, was a misstep.
He's criticizing Trump for not being harsh enough on criminals. He is arguing for more authoritarianism from the right. This single response confirms Kyle's entire thesis. Michael isn't a thinker. He's a sycophant wrapped in a veneer of intellectualism. And Kyle is about to rip it off.
He's only right about 99.78% of the time. So the First Step Act, I thought, was a misstep. But I would say the rest. Excuse me. I would say the rest of the.
Now that is trolling, and yet accurate. Kyle adopts the alt-right's favourite insult and turns it against Michael. Cuck. But there is a double meaning here. Michael isn't just submitting to Trump, he's watching Trump screw the country and enjoying it.
Such a cuck.
But I would say the rest. Excuse me. I would say the rest of the.
Such a cuck.
And by repeating it 3 times, Kyle denies Michael the ability to speak. He's not just calling him a cuck, he's making him one. Michael can't get a word in. He's being dominated in real time, which is exactly what this insult accuses him of. Kyle is enforcing the frame. Michael presents himself as an intellectual, but he's just a cheerleader getting off on the destruction.
The rest, excuse me, I would say the rest of the the administration has been very successful. What's your problem? What's
my problem is that you're a cuck and you're a hack and you're not an independent thinker and you're meat riding Trump.
Notice how Kyle is stacking the emasculating imagery. Tickle his taint.
Or you're going to tickle his taint for the rest of your fucking life.
Cuck.
Say the rest of the.
Such a cuck.
And now, meat riding.
And you're meat riding Trump.
Each one frames Michael's loyalty to Trump in sexually submissive terms. This isn't just crude insults, it's Kyle speaking directly to the MAGA base in their own language. These are the insults that they throw at people who they see as weak. Kyle isn't just redirecting them, he's pointing out that Michael is the very thing they claim to despise.
And you're not an independent thinker and you're meat riding Trump.
Why do you
and
say
you
that?
know that what he's doing in imperialism and you don't care.
I just answered your question and I corrected
Congratulations.
Kyle weaponizes Michael's previous answer instantly. When Michael claims that he just answered your question, Kyle retorts with the data point, 99.78%. The number that was supposed to be a joke now functions as a badge of shame. Kyle has turned Michael's own words into a noose.
Yeah, 99.78%. Congratulations.
Really appreciate the role reversal here. Michael is usually the troll, the smug provocator who mocks liberals for sport, but Kyle has beaten him at his own game. He's won the factual argument and the rhetorical one. Michael is scrambling for footing, while Kyle runs circles around him.
Yeah, 99.78%. Congratulations. You rented your brain to a war criminal pedophile. I hope you're happy.
Setting aside that Michael hasn't corrected anything, he's just been playing semantics, Kyle escalates the moral stakes. He's not just calling Michael a hack, he's attaching him to specific documented crimes. War criminals, pedophile, rapist.
I hope you're happy.
These aren't hyperbole. They're matters of public record. The drone strikes, the Soleimani assassination, the Eddie Gallagher pardon, the Epstein Association, the E. Jean Carroll verdict. And in doing this, Kyle is forcing Michael to either defend associations with these charges or ignore them entirely. He's raising the cost of loyalty. And there's strategy here beyond the mere insult. Kyle knows the MAGA movement doesn't care about facts, logic, or even the law. This entire debate has demonstrated that. So he's targeting the few moral principles they still claim to hold. They say that they care about protecting children. They say that they care about sexual violence. Hence the appeal to Trump as a pedophile rapist. Not because Kyle expects Michael to engage with the evidence, but because it forces him to publicly swallow the rot at the core of this administration, something intolerable for anyone who actually holds the values they profess. So Kyle hasn't just exposed Michael's submission on Venezuela, he's forced him to swallow Epstein too, and smile while doing it.
You rented your brain to a war criminal pedophile. I hope you're happy.
A war criminal pedophile rape? You brought up a point. You brought up international law, and you made a very false point, a dumb point, which is that international law began only a few hundred years ago. I corrected you.
Michael refuses to engage with the Epstein sting. Instead, he tries to drag the conversation back to his safe space, the timeline of international law. He's attempting to restart the debate he thinks that he can win and abandon the one that he's losing.
You made a very false point, a dumb point, which is that international law began only a few hundred years ago.
But notice the straw man that he constructs, misrepresenting the argument to make it easier to attack. Kyle didn't say international law began a few hundred years ago. He said the specific framework that prohibits conquest, Geneva, Nuremberg, the UN, is modern. Michael is attacking a position that Kyle never held.
I corrected you, and I pointed out that the international law is part of the Western tradition. That, excuse me one second. It goes back to antiquity. It's a principle of the jus gentium. And then you said, well, international law has failed because of the League of Nations failure, which I think is actually undermining your argument and proving my point and proving Trump's point, because the liberal internationalism that was established by people like Woodrow Wilson did in fact fail, which is why we need to restore an older and more classical conception of the international order, which is precisely what Trump's doing.
Listen to what Michael is actually arguing. He's calling for the destruction of the current international order, which he frames as failed.
The liberal internationalism that was established by people like Woodrow Wilson did in fact fail.
And he wants to replace it with a classical conception of order rooted in Roman ideals.
Which is why we need to restore an older and more classical conception of the international order.
If that sounds familiar, it should. Oxford scholar of fascism, Roger Griffin, defines fascism as centered on national rebirth, the destruction of a degenerate present order, and its replacement with a mythologized golden age, often rallying behind a single heroic figure. Michael is checking every box. For him, the post-World War II framework is the degeneracy. Rome is the golden age. Trump is the hero. He's not refuting Kyle's accusation of might makes right, he's confirming it while wrapping it in academic language and hoping that no one notices. You know, just like what Nazis did.
Which is precisely what Trump's doing. So I think you've hoisted yourself with your own petard.
Might makes right. Law of the jungle might make right.
Kyle refuses to engage with the intellectual dressing. He keeps translating Michael's flowery language back into the brutal reality. Whatever you call it, jus gentium, classic order, Western tradition, it means powerful nations take what they want. That is what might makes right means. He's stripping the varnish off the furniture, showing what the wood actually looks like underneath.
Make a lot of vulgar sort of non sequiturs because you don't have a leg to stand on.
All right, let me bring in...
Let me ask you this question. Hold on, Piers, let me ask him a question real quick. Tell me the name of the Minister of Defense in Venezuela.
Phenomenal follow-up from Kyle here. He shifts suddenly from theory to a specific fact, and it serves as a competence check.
Tell me the name of the Minister of Defense in Venezuela.
You see, Michael has been advocating for US policy in Venezuela, defending Trump's right to bomb boats and intervene in the country's affairs.
It's a stroke of brilliance, I think.
Kyle is now testing whether Michael actually knows anything about Venezuela beyond the talking points. If he can name the Minister of Defense, fine, he's done some homework. If he can't, his geopolitical expertise is revealed as performance. He absolutely should know this.
Tell me the name of the Minister of Defense in Venezuela.
I don't know. Whatever his name is.
Michael can't answer. Vladimir Patrino Lopez. Michael doesn't know. And notice the dismissive whatever his name is. He's trying to reclaim the don't give a fuck energy. But Kyle already owns that ground.
I don't know. Whatever his name is.
The dismissiveness that might normally play as swagger just looks like cope. Michael is advocating for the removal of a government he knows nothing about. The intellectual facade cracks. Kyle's earlier accusation, hack, not a thinker, is validated by a single failed quiz question.
You're a cuck and you're a hack and you're not an independent thinker.
Now, Kyle goes for the contradiction at the heart of Michael's position.
I don't know. Whatever his name is.
And that's the problem, is that you're advocating for a regime change. You don't know the first thing.
I didn't. I just said the opposite. I argued against a regime change.
He actually said the opposite.
Michael claims he argued against regime change, but he just spent the entire previous segment defending Trump's classical right to intervene, defending the bombing of narco-terrorists.
He bombed
Somalia and Nigeria and Iran.
He bombed
He's threatening Greenland.
Defending the imperial prerogative. He dressed up in Latin.
International laws, the jus gentium goes back to antiquity.
His entire position, appealing to pre-modern law that permits conquest, is a defense of American intervention. He's trying to have it both ways. Support the method, distance himself from the outcome. It is pathetic.
I just said the opposite. I argued against a regime change.
He actually said the opposite. I heard Michael.
I just want to correct something.
You said I'm arguing for a regime change. The regime remains there, right? So he said the opposite, in fact.
Unsurprisingly, Piers steps in to validate Michael's defense.
Say the rest of the...
He conflates the regime is still there with he didn't advocate regime change.
I heard Michael Knowles say the regime remains there, right?
As if abducting a head of state is somehow not regime change because you skipped the puppet government. The US invaded Venezuela and took its president. That is not a failed coup, my dude. That is a coup that didn't bother with the formalities.
He said the opposite, in fact. I want to bring in Coleman.
No, but he wanted to take out Maduro. Don't give me that cutesy little BS.
Notice that Kyle isn't just fighting Knowles here, he's fighting the moderator too. Piers tried to close the door on the regime question change, and Kyle kicked it back open. Don't give me that cutesy little dance is Kyle refusing to let the host reframe the argument into something easier to dismiss.
Don't give me that cutesy little BS.
Yes, but he made the point that the regime is still... He made the point the regime is still there, and the vice president appears to be much more compliant with running Venezuela the way America would prefer for its national security than Maduro. So that's what Michael said. He didn't advocate regime change.
What even is this? That's like saying, I didn't fire you, your desk is still here. Piers' defense of Michael is absurd on its face. He just said that the new leader is more compliant with the US. What is a regime change if it is not installing a more compliant government?
The vice president appears to be much more compliant with running Venezuela the way America would prefer for its national security than Maduro.
The Maduro abduction proves that Kyle's entire framework was correct. Might makes right isn't a warning, it is a description of what already happened. The classical conception of international order that Michael advocates for delivered exactly what Kyle said it would. A powerful nation taking what it wanted because it could.
Such a cuck.
But I would say the rest. Excuse me. I would say the rest of the.
Such a cuck.
Alrighty. So, what did we just witness? Oh, that is freezing. Michael Knowles came to this debate armed with Latin phrases and appeals to antiquity, hoping to make imperial conquest sound like intellectual tradition.
It goes back to antiquity. It's a principle of the jus gentium.
He relied on an obvious equivocation, swapping Kyle's definition of international law for one that permits conquest. But Kyle refused to let him hide in abstraction. Every time that Michael retreated to Rome, Kyle dragged him back to Venezuela, to Yemen, to the fishing boats.
He bombed fishing boats from Venezuela, Trinidad and Tobago, and Colombia. He just did the regime change in Venezuela. He bombed Yemen and Somalia and Nigeria and Iran.
Every time Michael dressed up might makes right in academic language, Kyle stripped off the varnish and showed us what was underneath. Fascism.
Might make right.
Your own petard.
Might make right. Law of the jungle might make right.
Not as an insult, but as a definition. And before anyone says, you call everything you don't like fascist, this isn't it. Michael met every criterion. The destruction of a failed order, the return to a mythologized golden age, the heroic leader. He checked every box on Roger Griffin's list while insisting that he was just defending Western tradition. And when the facts weren't landing, and he knew that they wouldn't, Kyle shifted gears. He stopped debating and started ridiculing, using the language off the populist right against their own spokesman. Tickle his taint.
Or you're going to tickle his taint for the rest of your fucking life.
Such a cuck.
Say the rest of the...
Such a cuck.
Each one landing harder than any policy argument could.
You rented your brain to a war criminal file rapist. I hope you're happy.
Because here's the lesson. You don't defeat fascists by out-arguing them. Their audience doesn't care about facts. Not really. Certainly not about logic, certainly not even about law. You defeat them by making them look weak in front of the crowds that worship strength. Kyle understood the assignment. When you agree with your movement's leader 99.78% of the time, you aren't a thinker, you're a cultist. And when you dress up might makes right in a toga and call it classical order, you aren't an intellectual. You're just a fascist with a thesaurus. And Kyle made sure that everyone saw it.
What's your problem?
You're a cuck and you're a hack and you're not an independent thinker and you're meat-riding Trump.
Why do you say
that?
You
know that what he's doing in imperialism and you don't care.
As always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to everyone who supports the channel, be it on Patreon, YouTube members, and of course, our wonderful sponsors.